I'm Rhoda Peters, and I worked at St. Paul Church from 1979 to 1989, 10 of the richest years in my life. I've been a member of the Methodist Church for 75 years.
What did you do at St. Paul when you worked there?
Well, I went there with the title of Director of Programs, which meant that I worked with all of the mission and ministry areas in what was then called the Council on Ministry. Later, my title was changed to Minister of Programs. And again, I was an associate pastor in all mission and ministry areas.
How has St. Paul influenced your growth?
So Dr. McAdams knew I was looking for a new position. He called and asked me to come for an interview because St. Paul was looking for a new staff member in the area of programming. And I did, and after some 2-3 weeks, and I think 2 interviews, they offered me the position.
So what did the staff consist of? Senior pastor?
At that time, there was Dr. McAdams, the senior pastor, Michael Beatty, who was the organist choir master and had come about 3 months before I did. St. Paul staff had just really been way down because they had lost some membership. And then I was the third full-time staff member.
Wow, so 3.
There were 3 of us in a church. I think when I went there, probably about 1,400 members. It grew to 2,000 in that 10 years I was there.
Adams was maybe as much of an influence.
He was a tremendous influence in my life. He was what I would call a steady hand. He never got ruffled or too upset. And if a problem came up, he'd say, "Now let's sit down and figure this out." And that was his approach to life and to faith.
That's nice. Find the answer to the
He was a
problem,
wonderful
not just-
person to work with. Mm-hmm.
What,
And while I was there, the first addition was made to the education building, and to give more space for Sunday school. And that included the what is now I think called Room 100, but the additional fellowship hall on the first floor.
was parking always a problem?
Yes, always.
Was it always a challenge?
And comes and goes. For a while, Kroger store, I believe, was across the street, and they allowed us to use their lot on Sundays. Well, they moved out, and the next tenant didn't want us to use the lot on Sundays.
That happens.
So then we began to buy some property up the alley there that we could use for parking. The sad thing was that back in the 40s and 50s, when St. Paul was a very large congregation, they had bought about 3 or 4 houses up Douglas Boulevard and would have had plenty of room for parking had they taken down those houses. But they got worried when they began to lose some members in the 70s, and they sold off all the houses. So they didn't have any property, and they had to buy up the alley. They bought up the backs of lots. People were willing, and parking is still a problem.
It's always a challenge, yeah. But what do you think will be the next 50, 100 years of St. Paul?
Well, I think St. Paul is on a trajectory of really reaching out in that community. One member at St. Paul said to me they wondered why St. Paul grew and grew fairly rapidly, and several other churches in the neighborhood didn't grow at that same time. But I think it was because St. Paul did find a way to reach out and to welcome people, and that has continued. So young adults are coming back to the church. That was always one of Dr. McAdams' strengths. He attracted young adults to the church. Well, St. Paul I always called a bellwether church, and a bellwether is a person or a body that leads, sort of leads the culture. And I would notice as I would read in United Methodist periodicals about this was happening and that was happening. Usually it was all happening at St. Paul. Another good thing about St. Paul, it's a broad mix of faith perspectives, from, I would say, the more conservative to the more liberal. Um, Many people would have known Dr. David Stewart, who was a member there for many years, and on the conservative side of that spectrum, and Miss Jenny Sheldorf, who was the children's director for many years, and on the more liberal side of that perspective. And they often disagreed, and often disagreed rather vocally. And I met Dr. Stewart in the hall one day. I can't remember what the current argument was about, but he was trying to convince me that he was right and Miss Sheldorf was wrong. And he said, now, I just don't agree with her on a lot of things. And then he said, but you know, I defend her right to state her position and believe as she sees fit. And it was that kind of tolerance of each other across the board that made St. Paul so special. I think also music at St. Paul has been a tremendous influence in that congregation. And they have continued to keep strong music directors and choirs, and that ministers to people. It was a wonderful period in my life. I think my faith became more adult as I interacted with people there. And I still have many good friends at St. Paul. But we visit St. Paul often. And once a year, I teach in the LOA class.
Oh, nice.
And always enjoy going back for that. I guess if I wanted to add a postscript, I would say about my entire life and my life at St. Paul, to God be the glory.